Once you're happy with your edit, we need to export our sequence into an actual video file that we can then share with other people or upload to the internet. Now let me unmute my tracks right here. Be sure to do that because otherwise if your tracks are muted and you export your video, there will be no sound. Now in order to tell Premiere Pro which parts of a sequence you want to export, you need to define your in and out points. Now our video is round about 23 seconds long. You can see that on the time indicator up here in the top left hand side for our playhead position. And I want to export everything from the beginning up until the very end. So let's come to the very beginning. Let's right click onto this playhead at the top of the timeline indicator and select to mark in. And this is similar to what we did with the source monitor. We need to tell it which part of the sequence are we actually interested in. So let's say mark in. And again, it's going to select from that point everything forward. But if I zoom out, well, that's going to export a whole lot of other stuff after our clip. So there would be a whole lot of black at the end if we exported this. So let's zoom in at the end of our clip. Come over to the left-hand side. Let's snap the timeline cursor to the end. And you can hold down Shift and drag this timeline cursor to kind of snap it between those edit points. I'm going to snap it to the end. Let's zoom in a little bit. Right-click onto this playhead and select to mark out. By the way, you can also press I and O to do that. This doesn't indicate that there's shortcut keys for that here. Let's select to mark out. And if I now come back to the beginning, this whole section is now marked as my in and out area. And if I export this sequence, that's the part of the sequence that will get exported into a video file. Once you've defined the in and out points for your sequence, come up into File, Export. And here at the very top, you want to select to export media. There's a whole lot of other options and other formats you can export in, but only export media will turn into an actual video file. So select to export media. And that is going to pop open the export dialog. On the left-hand side, you have a preview window, and I highly recommend with the timeline down here at the bottom, scrub through your project and make sure that this is actually the clip that you expect to be exported. And that looks fine to me. And then over on the right hand side, we need to define our export settings. Now there's a lot in here, and we're not going to go through all of it, but let's touch on the main points that you need to configure properly to export your first video project. The first thing is the format, and this will determine the file ending of your file. Now there are lots of options in here. Most of the time, if you want to share with friends or you just want to upload it to YouTube or Vimeo or Facebook, H.264 is a good option. There are lots of different video codecs to choose from in here, like image sequences and AVI, which is an uncompressed format. The file sizes will be very big. But again, everything comes down to a bit of a trade-off between, do you want a sequence of images? Do you want a video file? And then for that video file, how much quality do you want versus how big do you want that file to be? H.264 is a very popular video codec. The files will turn into .mp4 files, so let's select that. And then underneath that, you can select a preset. Now this preset defines the resolution, but also the quality of that final exported video. You can set up your own presets, and I've got a bunch of them here for Surface Studio specifically, but I would recommend if you're just starting out, select the one that makes the most sense for you. So for example, let's say I want to export it to YouTube and I want it to be a 1080p video, like a 1920 by 1080 full HD video. The option is down here at the bottom, you can't see it, but if I select it, you'll see this is now set to YouTube 1080p full HD. And once you've modified all of the settings down in here, you can actually save this off as your own custom preset. Next, let's define an output name. You can simply click onto this output name and find a location as well as a name for this file where you want to save your video to. So let's save it down here in my render folder as my first edit. Hit save. Now do make sure you have both export video and export audio enabled. Otherwise, well, it's either going to be a black video or a silent movie. And then down here in the summary, just check that this makes sense. So we're going to export a file called myfirstedit.mp4 at 1080p, so 1920 by 1080, a pixel aspect ratio of 1 at 23.976 frames per second. Now the bitrate we'll talk about in just a little bit, and we're going to export this with 48 kilohertz in stereo. Now, a little bit further down, we now find a whole bunch of different settings for effects, video, audio, multiplexer, captions, where we want to publish it to. You can actually publish directly to Facebook from here. Personally, I've never really used these. I just turn this into a video file and then just upload it myself. Now, the most important settings are probably under video. First off, your width and height. Now this will by default be defined by our sequence, but you can override them here if you wanted to export your video in a smaller format to keep the file smaller. I'm just going to leave it at 1920 by 1080, which we defined in our sequence. Again, frame rate, you could override these if you unchecked the default. You can actually just, you can literally override all of these settings again here. But I'm going to leave all of these ones at default. Encoding settings, don't worry too much about that. That has to do with how the media is then going to be compressed and pushed into this format, this MP4 file at the end. It gets very technical in here. You can ignore almost all of them. The biggest lever you have to control the quality of your output file is the bitrate. So go into the bitrate settings, and down here you will be able to define a target bitrate in megabits per second. The higher you make this number, the more quality will get retained in the final video, but also the larger that file is going to get. Now, Premiere Pro actually tries to estimate the file size of what you're going to get out of this. So right now it sets at 186 megabytes. If I bring down the bitrate to, let's say, 10, it now says my file is probably going to be about 31 megabytes in size. And this just comes down to a little bit of preference, a little bit playing around. Personally, I usually set it to around 30. 30 is generally pretty good, but it depends a lot on the type of clips you use, like whether you use, pixel clip art graphics or just more organic looking footage. You may have to tweak this a little bit. Generally, if you start around 20 to 30 for the bitrate, you should be fine. There's a couple of advanced settings, but again, don't worry too much about those. The main ones in the video settings here is the bitrate, which determines the quality as well as the size of the final output file. And then your width and height, make sure the resolution is exactly what you're expecting it to be. And then now you can queue it, which pushes it into Adobe Media Encoder. But again, that'd be a totally different course. Don't worry about that. Simply hit export, and that's going to export your sequence into an actual video file. Once that's done, let's come into our render folder, and here's my file. MyFirstEdit.mp4 ended up being about 70 megabytes in size for about 25 seconds of video. And now you can simply play this file back and check out your final video project. Now, while this should be enough to get you started, in the next section I do want to cover a few more advanced topics like adding transitions and effects and layering videos and audio on top of each other to really round out, enhance and spice up your edit to create a much more compelling and much more exciting final video.